Resistance against the regime of Augusto Pinochet took on many forms. For your average citizen, they would attend protest or would go on strike. For the few who joined the FPMR, they would attack infrastructure, rob stores, and assassinate government officials. The MIR did much of the same. However, one of their little adventures that stuck out the most was their attempt to establish a front of guerrillas in the hills of Neltume. While I did cover this in my video about armed resistance, I ended up leaving out a bunch of small little details for time's sake. Basically, this video exists because I didn't have time to explain it in a video that I made because I didn't have time to explain it in my initial video about Pinochet. While the story of Neltume is rather short, it is still one of the more unique tales in Chilean history. By 1973, the MIR was no stranger to the area surrounding Neltume. The rural branch, the Movimiento Campesino Revolucionario, had a stronghold in the Panguipulli sawmill, which was established after the requisition of land as part of Allende's agrarian reform. Initially, the MCR was led by Moises Huentalaf, but after he was killed in a land requisition, he was succeeded by José Gregorio Allende Vera, also known as Commander Pepe. On September 11, 1973, the day of the coup, Commander Pepe took charge of a force of 200 militants in an assault on Neltume's local police station. Despite heavily outnumbering the 5 carabineros defending the station, the MCR only had one rifle with 6 bullets, some dynamite, and a few Molotovs for everyone to share. The militants were unable to take the police station. After the arrival of more carabineros, the militants were forced to disperse. Commander Pepe led a group of survivors in an attempt to reach Argentina. They, however, were detained and imprisoned. For leading this little rebellion, Commander Pepe was tried by a war council in Valparaíso and sentenced to death. His death was followed by 10 others, most of which were workers from around Neltume and university students. Many of them were only in their 20s. The aftermath of the military coup was a very rough time for the MIR. Their leader, Miguel Enriquez, had been killed and many of its other members went into exile. Between 1976 and 1977, the MIR began a process of reincorporating its scattered members back into the organization. In 1977, Nelson Gutierrez proposed that the MIR should start sending back its members back into Chile, in a plan that would later become Operación Retorno. One of its main objectives was the installation of 2 fronts of guerrillas in the hills of Neltume and Nahuelbuta. This plan, along with the rest of Operación Retorno, was heavily questioned by the members of the MIR, with some of them even saying that it was just a little bourgeoisie whim of Pascal Allende, the faction's leader. Many of the members that would go on to fight in Neltume, such as Cabrera Fernandez Miguel, aka Commander Pene, were given training in Cuba at the Luciano Cruz School. Surprisingly, there seems to have been a greater focus on ideological training rather than practical skills. On top of that, the men were kept in the dark, with only 1 out of 3 platoons fully aware of their mission. As part of the preparations, Commander Pene traveled to several countries in search of survivors from the 1973 Battle of Neltume. When in Sweden, he got in contact with an ex-member named El Pinky. Pinky was a former worker from southern Chile and had received training in Cuba. After the 1973 coup, he spent a considerable amount of time hiding in the hills before he was caught and later exiled. If anyone could help them with this mission, it was him, but he refused, saying that the area was not suitable for their desired goals. While he was never told directly, the MIR cut off all contact with him, basically kicking him out of the organization. Not fazed by his warning, Pine continued to plan the operation. Before even arriving in Chile, 30% of the militants deserted. On top of that, only 50% of those who remained were relegated to the mission. They were even working off of inadequate maps for the planning of the operation. The first group to reach Neltume did so in February 1980, and consisted of 7 men. Their task was to explore the area and set up the minimal conditions to sustain the insurgency. Interestingly, 4 out of the 7 men, including the commander, hadn't received any training in Cuba. The men separated into 2 groups, one of 3 and another of 4, and were supposed to monitor the border crossings of Argentina. After that, they were supposed to meet up in a designated area, but failed to do so. Speaking about Argentina, it is believed that they were aided by the People's Revolutionary Army, who may have helped members of the MIR cross through their country. The group of 4 fell apart and many of them went into exile. The group of 3 were more successful and were joined by 2 other militants, raising their number to 5. However, they too dispersed after some time. The MIR then attempted to send another group, but one of its members was detained in Argentina and another one fled to Europe. One of the main issues that the MIR was facing was communication, as their members assigned to the task were ill-suited for it. In July, another group of 3 militants led by a man referred to as Pedro arrived in Neltume and started to consolidate the front. Later in November, Pedro's men met up with a few other insurgents in a camp referred to as El 25. In total, there were 12 of them. The group began to explore the mountains of Lipinza, located beside Lake Pirihueico. Even after several attempts, the insurgents still lacked proper communications and navigation equipment, because obviously it never occurred to them that those things were going to be important. To add to their misfortune, the MIR hadn't established a base of support amongst the locals, which is going to have very dire consequences later. A new group of militants, who would later become the Destacamento Guerrillero Toquilautero, arrived in Neltume, and another smaller group set up in Nahuelbuta in spring that year. The group in Neltume will receive some much needed help by a forester, whose identity has remained unknown. Since his job consisted of working in the forest, he could travel in and out of town without drawing any suspicion, giving the insurgents some much needed supplies. So far, the war effort was off to a pathetic start. The higher-ups within the MIR were so disconnected from the realities on the ground that they continued to support this little misadventure. They even believed that their men could completely sustain themselves by foraging in the forest, something that was completely illogical. Getting supplies to the insurgents required a lot of manpower, and the men out in the woods couldn't really carry much with them. The Central Force, which was basically the MIR's best unit, even had to dedicate most of their time to supporting the effort in Neltume. Worst of all this movement meant that they were leaving behind lots of evidence. Yet, by some miracle, the authorities hadn't detected them. If they had, then this would have been over far sooner. By the start of 1981, the logistics of the operation had significantly improved, with the acquisition of several vehicles and the establishment of the Red Moncho, or Moncho Line. By now, you may be surprised by the fact that the insurgents had remained hidden from the authorities for so long, but that would change very shortly. In the month of February, José Alejandro Campos y Fuentes and Luis Quinchavil Suarez were detained by Argentine police at the Juan border crossing. Both men were members of the MIR and were carrying fake IDs. Since then, the two of them have never been seen again alive, presumably killed by the Argentine regime. On March 18th, Pino and his men set up their winter camp northeast of Neltume and south of Liquiñe. Needing supplies for the coming winter, they sent a group of men to the town of Puerto Fui. While leaving, their trail was picked up by some locals who thought they were animals. They followed the trail all the way back to the insurgents' camp and got a glimpse of its occupants. The insurgents had been detected in the past by the locals. Usually, they would come up with some sort of cover story to hide their true intentions. However, none of the locals were dumb enough to believe it. Interestingly, they never gave up any info to the authorities. But the most recent encounter would be different. Immediately after spotting them, the locals informed the Carabineros, who then contacted the Chilean Army's 4th Division. This was the start of Operación Machete, a counterinsurgency operation with a force of 2,500 soldiers, made up of members of the Carabineros, CNI, and Army Special Forces. On the 27th of June, an MIR camp came under attack by the Black Berets. During the fight, the insurgents fled into the forest, leaving behind medicine, food, documents, and weapons. The only one who escaped with a weapon was Commander Pene, armed with a single pistol. The insurgents had hidden almost all of their weapons to avoid being caught with them. It may seem like a stupid thing to do, but being seen without any firearms would be less suspicious. However, with the army flooding the area with troops, accessing their hidden stashes became almost impossible in this time of need. Low on supplies, a group of survivors sent out 2 of their men into town. However, the 2 of them were captured and were most likely forced to give up the locations of supply caches. One group of survivors, led by Pedro, lost 2 of their members, reducing their force to 8. One of the lost insurgents managed to escape the forest, and the other, named Juan Ojeda Aguayo, also known as Gabriel, tried to organize support from the local farmers till he was later detained. Pedro and his men later reunited with Pine's group, who, realizing how fucked the situation was, tried to contact with their leaders in Santiago. A group of 5 were sent out of the area to the town of Panguipulli. Once there, they split into 2 groups. The first group of 3 men went back to Santiago, while the second group of 2 were supposed to head to the town of Blanco for supplies, but on their way, they were detained in Hueyahue. On the 11th of September, the camp south of Liquiñe was discovered by state forces. While no one from the MIR was killed that day, the casualties would soon follow. On the 13th of that month, Raul Rodrigo Obregón Torres was executed by the CNI after they found his camp. 4 days later, Pedro Yanes Palacios, who had his foot amputated due to gangrene, was executed off the bank of the Cuacua River. As the war effort in Neltume started to fall apart, the MIR decided to send a contingent of 25 troops, led by Nelson Arenada Luisa, to Nahuelbuta. However, it would be a while till they arrived. On the 19th, the only fatality suffered by the state occurred when a young conscript named Nahuel Pan Manuel was killed in a friendly fire incident close to Neltume. The insurgents separated further. A group of 3 comprised of Patricio Enriquez, José Sandoval, and Prospero Guzman sought shelter in a house belonging to a family member. But in a turn of events, they were ratted out to the authorities, and on the 20th were all killed. The following day, 2 other militants had been detained in Santiago and were also killed. After what was essentially a massacre, the remaining insurgents managed to avoid the authorities for around a month, but it wouldn't last long till the death toll started to rise. On the 26th of October, Commander Pene and his group came under attack by the Carabineros. Pene, being the only one with a gun, fought back. Unfortunately for him, he stood no chance and was killed. The last member of the MIR to die in Neltume was Juan Ojeda Aguayo, also known as Gabriel, who was killed on the 28th of November in Quebrada Honda. The insurgency in Nahuelbuta wasn't doing any better. Just a few days before, on the 10th of November, Nelson Arenada and 3 other militants were gunned down by police in Santiago on Camino Las Vizcachas. The CNI claimed that the 4 men were trying to assassinate the Minister of Foreign Affairs. However, it was later discovered that the event was staged and that their deaths were the result of a brutal execution. With the loss of Nelson Arenada, the guerrilla in Nahuelbuta ended before it even got a chance to start. After the events in Neltume, the typical bullshit followed. The executions were framed as shootouts and most of the perpetrators got off scot-free. The leaders of the MIR concluded that their inability to obtain support from the local population was the result of their failure. There's also the fact that CNI informants ratted out many of the militants before even reaching Neltume. While this was certainly part of it, there were also other factors, the first being numbers. While I can't say for certain just how many troops the MIR had, I'm confident in saying that there were no more than 30 at any given time. All it took Pinochet's regime was a small fraction of their power to stop them. The second was the environment. The MIR was better suited for operating in urban areas, where they could hide amongst the public. All it took was a single sighting for the authorities to begin cracking down. In total, 15 members of the MIR were killed and 4 more were captured. As for the survivors, it's safe to assume that they either deserted the organization or continued their fight elsewhere. Overall, it was a pointless endeavor that was doomed from the start.
Los que ponen que se ve trabado, ¿ustedes se piensan que yo no me doy cuenta que se ve trabado? Porque tengo la calidad acá, me aparecen los kilobytes, ¿entendés? Me aparecen los kilobytes, yo sé cuando se ve trabado. Entonces no pongas se ve trabado. Si sabés que estoy con un celular entre edificios y está lloviendo desde hoy, no pongas se ve trabado. Porque lo que tenés trabado es acá, tenés trabado un patio en la cabeza que no te deja